Isn't it so crazy how many people you come across with on the subway? Everybody has a story, a destination, a struggle, an identity. It makes you realize that you may have even seen people that you've encountered before, and it makes you reality check. So, reality check. What is art? How is art formed? And who is art entitled to on the subway? What if I proposed, and bear with me, what if I proposed alienation as an art form? It's crazy, right? It wouldn't be the first time I've heard it. So, come, follow me. Alienation as an art form. So, alienation. Alienation came to existence in the modern era of the 50s and 60s. It was used by intellectuals to explain the outpour of poverty, inequality, social immobility, and other cultural differences of this time. Karl Marx transformed alienation to, quote, a concrete social condition. He believed, quote, alienation is rooted in the capitalist mode of production. It became a metaphorical place in which the individual was denying their self and they were becoming separate from their labor. Cue the birth of Marxist humanism. What is interesting about alienation in our subways is that it ties into Marx's ideas about alienation causing human beings to be defined by their work, therefore lost internally and physically. So we become powerless. Alienation in our subways happens through a number of events. People do not talk to one another on the subway, people do not share ideas or compliment one another, sometimes bullying even occurs. It's quite rare to even smile to one another on the subway. People just think you're weird.
I mean, unless they're staring at you oddly, then I might be like, why are you staring at me?
But what's interesting about all that is in fact the power alienation is holding to us and what it is creating in an artistic sense. In the early 1970s, geographers started to analyze the effects of places and spaces and how they differ. Edward Ralph wrote the book Place and Placelessness. In this book, he outlines the idea of a, quote, taken for granted nature of place and its significance as an inescapable dimension of human life and experience. He quotes, to be human is to live in a world that is filled with significant spaces. To be human is to have and to know your place. So where is our place on the subway?
Greenwood is my station. That's where I get off to go home, and it's always been I've always had to go there to see my grandmother or like visit my family store, which is at Greenwood. So I feel like Greenwood's a pretty, I identify with that, I'd say, and maybe Victoria Park.
Yeah, no, I just go in and then I find a seat. I don't even think about it.
I would say definitely a corner seat, far back to the corner, gotta get away from all the people, just chill, listen to my music. So yeah.
It's anywhere I can lean, so like the window thingies on like the area of the door, the wall on the other side, just knock out, take a nap, and ignore people.
So you see, places have all sorts of identities, and what these identities create are mass identities. Ralph argues that mass identities, similar to existential places, appear to an individual just in a cultural space or group. The subway would be, therefore, an existential place in which we are socialized to feel and act and identify with certain emotions and feelings. But what alienation does in an artistic and visual way is we physically see people subject to these concepts and ideas of mass identities controlling us. We stay away from one another, we judge one another, and together as a culture, we grow in alienation. Alienation in the sense of an art form simply means that visually you can see that through alienating one another, we in fact grow closer together. The problem with why we cannot see this, however, is simply ignorance. We choose to feel subjected to this capitalist view of the subway needing to control us. We allow the real world to take a back seat and we fall victims to the world of alienating one another, and because of this ignorance to pay attention to the small details, we move together in a boring motion of alienation, one person by one person, like a factory. Toronto-born geographer Sean McClellan exercises the concept of psychogeography. Psychogeography is the exploration of the psychological effects of an urban environment. He insists people on the act of walking and becoming lost in a city, what some other geographers in this study call the drift. He says, quote, getting lost in a city is a surefire way to learn how to get found again. And what strikes importance to this idea of alienation as an art form is that this here is the answer to breaking the cycle. Every day, we take the same routine, we listen to the same songs, we stare at the same posters, and we continue this ignorance and allow it to only get stronger. Rather, what Sean would argue and what I believe is that if we decided, hey, let's switch it up today, let's smile at someone, even if I'm having a bad day. What good can come out of that small smile is something that takes nothing but 2 seconds out of your day.
How I make connections is when you're on that rush hour commute home and it's that really long, tiresome commute, and then you hear the lady on the intercom and she's like, oh, shuttle bus, you gotta get off here and go here. And there's that collective look on everybody's face where they're all like, oh no. And you're all in this together, you connect, and then you race the shuttle buses and hate each other afterwards. That's how I make a connection.
Well, you know how there's always sometimes that weirdo kind of creepy guy that comes in, kind of smells a little funny, kind of harassing people, so you kind of look at all the other people around you and you make eye contact and you're all like, this guy's really weird, and you feel a connection with them, and that's how you know.
So you see, what's visually appealing to notice how we drift from one another is simply that through alienating one another, we bring together a mass of identities.
But there are some, interesting people. There's this guy that sometimes walks up and down playing his banjo, and he's kind of loud, but he's a nice guy, so sometimes I give him a little couple 10 cents here and there.
Well, they're the crazies, and then there are the stoned kids later at night, the ones that are doing chin-ups on the handlebars, and then there's the commuters, which are just, they keep themselves.
And at the end of the day, we still all share the same place on the subway, whether we're 3 carts away from one another or we're sitting right next to each other. What subway culture seems to influence into our minds is that it is not okay to be okay with that. Every day, the subway as an art form brings together an artistic community of so many differences we all choose to ignore and not identify with. So why? So what I proposed at the beginning of this video, alienation as an art form. What this means and how it can impact the subway culture is we can no longer choose to alienate from one another, regardless of our differences and our similarities, because we are all connected. We all share the same space, and maybe it's just a mode of transportation, as Amy says. Or maybe it's more, and some stations, as Olivia states, stand out more than others. Regardless of all that, Marx proposed that alienation was a capitalist view of work and labor and the product. But in this case, he stands incorrect. Alienation is more creative and artistic and cultural, simply defiant to the capitalist view of Marx. Alienation circles together a community that exists just before our eyes. It connects people from all around in one little space. Our subway. So alienation as an art form. I told you, it sounded kind of crazy. But in the end, alienation is something beautiful. It is something poetic. It's incredible how this world works, how it revolves, and how it brings people close together in a moment that can mean nothing today, but something tomorrow. So alienation actually challenges us every day the moment we enter the subway and do our daily routine. It challenges us to become aware and to cherish all the little details of one another that we visually can see right there, sharing the same space. And what is so important about these small details is simply this. The small details years from now, when you look back on them, will be the big things that made you who you are. So, don't forget the small details. They are so crucially important and so easy to recognize. Oh, and another thing. Smile on the subway. One smile today could last a lifetime for someone else. This was alienation as an art form.